The Quad is here to stay. That is what the leaders of the United States of America, Australia, India, and Japan announced today in the Wilmington Declaration. The focus of the Quad and the Quad Leaders Summit, which was held in the US, seems to be enhancing practical cooperation with real deliverables across the Indo Pacific region. While in the geopolitics of it, their statements on the situation in the South China Sea or the Russia Ukraine war, or this time the war in Gaza, seems to have certain similar formulations as previous statements by the Quad. There are certain interesting differences that we see. To discuss this, we have with us Dr. Harsh Pant, who is the Vice President of Strategic Studies at the Observer Research Foundation. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Pant.
Hello, Keshav. Good to be here.
So, I wanted to start with, there's a very interesting line at the end, the last line of the Wilmington Declaration of the joint statement, which says the Quad is here to stay, right? And the reason I bring this up is because 50% of the leaders we have seen at the table, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida of Japan, as well as US President Joseph Biden, will not be there in 2025 at the next Leaders Summit, which is to be hosted by India, all going well, right? And all of the initiatives we've seen, the expansion of the Quad has been during their terms, along with Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Albanese from Australia. So what really do you see as, this statement that they've made, that the Quad is here to stay?
Well, I think this is a reflection, perhaps, of some of the greater confidence that is now there amongst the member states of Quad, and that we have achieved in a relatively short period of time enough to make a broader argument about our viability, which I think is important, given that still you hear refrain of from a number of quarters about questioning the sustainability of this platform. So I think, given, as you mentioned, that there is going to be a change of leadership both in Japan very soon, and then in January in the US, we will see a new leadership emerging, and a transition happening in two major countries of the Quad. It is also interesting that in fact, Prime Minister Modi, in some ways, would be the guarantor of Quad, if you will, given his tenure now, and given that he's the perhaps the only continuing thread in the evolution of the second phase of Quad, since 2017. So I think it is also now that the leadership, I think, also falls upon Prime Minister Modi in some ways to nurture this platform. But I do think that given that you still hear contrarian views about Quad in certain parts of the world, and I think that's something that countries like China play upon, right? If you keep on the sense alive that perhaps there is no longevity inherent in the idea of Quad, you also make Quad less credible. So I think because the idea of Quad is to give an alternative to the Chinese-led order that is emerging in the Indo-Pacific. So I think that is what this statement means. Perhaps it's an argument both to the domestic constituencies in these countries as well as to the international stakeholders that, look, this is a platform that is viable, that is sustainable, and that will continue to do the work that it has mapped out for itself, which I think is an important point. These countries should be making repeatedly, not simply one off.
Right, and there's something interesting that you said. The Chinese attempt of leading the global order, at least in the Indo-Pacific region, and we see here in the Wilmington Declaration a lot of talk about resilient port infrastructure, as well as this ports conference that they want to hold in Mumbai for the first time next year. So, do we see this sort of change in the Quad from being of needing a free and open Indo-Pacific to suddenly looking at real physical material deliverables apart from humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, or working together for maritime security? But now they're looking at port infrastructure, deepening their footprints across this region. So do you see this sort of change coming out of this declaration, sir?
I think, Keshav, this is a change you see, in the last few declarations gradually evolving. And I think this is also a reflection of Quad trying to find its own footing. When it had started, it was all about ideas. Now, operationalizing those ideas on the ground is the real need of the hour. And I think that is also part of its own credibility. So its credibility will be determined by how much it can achieve on the ground. So when you talk of, for example, health cooperation, sustainable development, etc., they do not give you any a real handle to really frame your response. In that sense, they become ideas that are there. But how do you operationalize some of these ideas, and how do you ultimately become an alternative to the Chinese-led order that China is trying to create? Which means that you have to enter gradually into those domains where China is present, where China is doing very well, where Chinese are much ahead of the curve. And in that sense, I think infrastructure and connectivity is something which is clearly the need of the hour in the region. And when you talk of ports, you really are trying to make a very tangible contribution to this debate. Excuse me. That this is not simply about. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to, add, hear your comment on this idea of when we talk about ports, because I mean, India and the US are jointly investing in the Western Port Terminal in Colombo, if I remember correctly, which is $500 million from the US DFC. So, but I mean, the sums that we're talking, or the format that we're talking, is very different from the BRI. So, how realistic then, you know, is this sort of idea of the Quad stepping into this field coming out?
I think it will have to be, the attempt would be to make it realistic. That look, at the end of the day, we also know that the sums that Chinese have promised in BRI are not materializing, right? So BRI is also facing a lot of challenges. And we have seen, for example, even in the neighborhood in South Asia, many of the projects are stuck. Many of the projects have led to greater economic problems. So I think for the Quad countries, this is an opportune time to make the case that look, we may not be offering you those kinds of sums and those kinds of resources, but what we are offering you is a partnership of four big countries in the world, in the region. And there, if those four countries can leverage their own strengths to then work together with you, then I think that is a different scale altogether. Where with China you are working under Chinese model. With China, the China becomes the only source where countries often become dependent on China. If you are coming as a Quad proposal, by definition, it's not a single country dominated argument. This is, you enter into that project arguing that look, there are four stakeholders here which are coming to you. Maybe in some cases two, maybe in some cases three, but it's going to be more of a not a unilateral setup like BRI, but a setup which is more about partnership, which is more about bringing the strengths of key players in the region. And therefore the sums may be small, the numbers might be small to begin with, but I think ultimately the sustainability is much higher. And whether you're looking at it from a financial perspective, from environmental perspective, in the through the lens of transparency and credibility, that would be much higher in these, when it comes to the Quad projects. So I think, and it is very important for Quad countries to do that, because ultimately that's where the real struggle is, that's where the real competition is. Because what Chinese have done with BRI is completely dominated the sector. You don't have any model, despite countries promising here and there, despite some of the other alternatives being proposed by Europe or by America, or by even India being partnering with third countries. Unless like-minded countries like the Quad countries come together and offer a credible alternative, I don't think you can manage China's expansion in this domain. And I think by focusing on ports, they are, there is an attempt to make it more focused. Unlike China's BRI, there is an attempt to only focus on ports to begin with, and then expand it perhaps. And I think ports, given what is happening to sea lanes of communication, there is also a subtle message to China that look, this is also about the disruption that we are witnessing across the world, both from state actors like China and non-state actors like the Houthis, for example, in the Red Sea.
Right. And the reason, this question that arises is, the Quad has, a large part of the declaration talks about maritime security, right? It talks about information. You have the Indo-Pacific Partnership for Maritime Domain Awareness, or the IPMDA, right, where you have an information fusion center here in Gurgaon. So I want to understand, the Quad started with, like you said, ideas. Then it focused on the Indo-Pacific as a maritime region, right? And now, if I remember correctly, the External Affairs Minister said a few months ago that there are 16 working groups under the Quad umbrella. And now you have these new announcements of ports about, maritime domain awareness, sharing of information. Is the Quad expanding or taking on too much in terms of practical deliverables that may affect, its actual successes on ground? Or is this a case of that these ideas already existed and the Quad is finally taking it forward with actual real steps?
See, Quad has a difficult task. In the sense, if you want to emerge as the central pivot around which the perhaps the architecture in the Indo-Pacific, or the strategic architecture in the Indo-Pacific, can be built. You have to delicate it. You have to balance it very delicately. Because a lot of the countries, including the four countries that are part of the Quad, have their own dynamic vis-a-vis China. And if you want to attract a lot of the a lot of the other countries in the region as partners, they are also very cagey and very about looking at having partnerships which are uh, anti-China in orientation. So overtly anti-Chinese agenda is unlikely to succeed. So how does Quad reshape or reframe its priorities in a very turbulent neighborhood is the challenge for the Quad. Now, therefore, when you the beginning of Quad, you saw 2017 onwards a lot of focus on issues like sustainable development, blue economy, infrastructure. Then you saw vaccines, for example, to begin with, and then health partnership today is very big, and this Quad also talks about taking it forward. So, in a sense, those issues where which are for public good, which can be seen as public good, and I think the term global goods is used. The provision for global goods is being made by Quad. And I think that's a sensible strategy in ways that it attracts a lot of partners without really making life difficult for them. So they can partner with Quad without really looking back at the shoulders and seeing how China will react. But I think the issue is how far is this sustainable? Now, when you talk of ports, we have seen how that whole debate on ports, even in the Chinese case, started by, oh, these are all civilian facilities, and eventually they became strategic outposts, right? So I think there is, I mean, from a strategic point of view, there shouldn't be any doubt that whatever development is going to come in infrastructure and ports, etc., that is going to have a strategic component, and that is the intent here. But how do you frame it? Perhaps you frame it around a number of key ideas, and that is what free and open Indo-Pacific, international law, freedom of navigation, those kinds of principles that are enunciated time and again as part of Quad declaration, they underscore. But I don't think that you know uh, Chinese are in any doubt as to what this is about. It's the way Quad countries are framing it and saying that, look, we are not against China in principle. If China acknowledges these principles, it can also be a partner in the wider, Indo-Pacific domain. But that's unlikely to happen, and we are going to see that contestation of ideas and contestation of operational realities on the ground. Uh, and in particular, I think when you say Indo-Pacific is a maritime space, so what you said, right? Maritime domain awareness. What does it mean? It means having an awareness of what others are doing in the region. So which means that you are now increasingly collecting information, synthesizing information, assessing information, analyzing information, sharing information. So what you're trying to do is looking at information space more from the point of view of how your strategic posturing can then evolve. So I don't think you can get away from this question of strategic posturing vis-a-vis China as part of what Quad is trying to do. But it's a very difficult task for Quad, and I think they have done relatively well by making it broader in scope, so that a number of other partners can continue to join it and do not look at it primarily through an anti-China lens. But whether this is sustainable and how far this is sustainable, I think that's a question for the future.
Right. And I mean, I just want to talk a little bit about India's sort of imprints on this declaration, because we see healthcare, we see these principles for the deployment of digital public infrastructure, which is, I think, a very important conversation, especially as we've seen, what has happened in Lebanon recently when we talk about, these kind of technical communication devices, right? So we see these principles that the Quad has announced. Today, we see India promising $2 million in solar projects across Fiji, Comoros, and Seychelles. Australia giving 50 million Australian dollars as a grant for clean and renewable energy. $122 million from Japan that has been committed to the same. So you sort of see this imprint of disaster resilience, or the CDRI. You see the International Solar Alliance, or its goals of the ISA that Prime Minister Modi has spoken about. You see health. You see these fellowships that we've announced. I think 50 students at engineering colleges in India for about $500,000 grant. So, what really do you see is this imprint that India is trying to do? Because these are things that Prime Minister Modi has mentioned time and time again when he has traveled across the world. So, what do you see India sort of gaining from making these commitments and sort of having these imprints on the final Quad declaration?
I think India perhaps is trying to do two things. One is, look, India has to increasingly, India is at least trying to make a case that India is not simply a traditional naysayer in global politics. It can contribute to global goods. And that, I think, that making, whatever our strengths are, we want to leverage that for the regional and global good. And I think that is something that you see across, whether it is health, whether it is education, whether it is maritime space, whether it is infrastructure, whatever whatever be our capabilities, we may not be the front and center in so many ways, but we have niche capabilities which we can offer, and we have areas where we can deploy those capabilities, areas where we are comfortable, areas where our capabilities allow us to reach out to, and areas where we can, with the help of our partners, we can reach out to. For example, South Pacific is clearly an area which was not on India's radar for a very long time. But now that we are part of Quad, now that our partnership with countries like Australia is galloping ahead, I think those are the areas where we can really now have an imprint. Where it is not simply, it then simply doesn't become a question of a country like China having an imprint, but also a country like India in partnership with its regional partners having an imprint. So I think India is leveraging its niche capabilities across the region, or at least trying to become a provider of certain kinds of public goods in that sense. The other thing India is trying to do is to leverage through its commitments this idea to its partners that, look, you should remain invested. We are invested, we are doing our best, but don't leave this space for a country like China to completely make us and others redundant. And I think that's a very important message, increasingly, given what is happening in the domestic political space in America in particular. And there is a lot of inward orientation. Both political parties are increasingly concerned about America first and then the world. And if countries like India that have resources and that are seen as rising powers in some ways do not contribute, then the debate will only intensify that why is America doing this in so many ways? Why isn't the regional countries, why aren't they shouldering a large part of this burden? So I think focusing and making commitments to ensure that others remain committed, which we want, the countries that we want, nations that we want, partners that we want to remain committed. And I think that's very important in this day and age. So clearly that commitment is also leading to other commitments from others. And I think what is interesting about Quad, in so many ways, Keshav, is that many people misunderstand it as, look, this is America's bidding. Chinese peddle this line that, oh, America is pulling India into its orbit, and Quad is America's grand design towards containing China. I think if you read it carefully, you would see that on its own, America would be, would much rather look at their inward, what is happening in their domestic space. American policymakers increasingly are, defining their foreign policy priorities through the lens of their Middle America and what their concerns are. But what has happened in the case of Quad is since 2017, and before 2017, it was uh, it was the Indians and the Japanese and the Australians who actually pushed America into this space. It was they who said, "Well, look, we are committing ourselves. You also come and join it." And it was Trump, whom they tried to, convince, and Trump got convinced. And we all know how difficult it is to convince Mr. Trump of anything that he doesn't believe in. And therefore, when he got, it was he who started the, Quad 2.0 process. So, in a sense, convincing the others, particularly the US, that their commitment to the Indo-Pacific is so critical, and that we are doing our best, and therefore you should not leave this space, is a very important part of this whole process. So I think Quad, what India is trying to do, is clearly also take ownership of a number of these initiatives. So I think Maitri initiative, which was announced in some ways, that India will be leading next year, hosting next year, is again, that what can India do, which can show that India is willing and able now to shoulder regional responsibilities, is a very important part of this projection. And as I said, in the first segment, that ultimately Prime Minister Modi would be leading this conversation, because he almost becomes the single most important thread in the evolution of Quad now.
Hmm. Right. And so this brings me to sort of my last question, and it brings the focus of Russia, because the declaration in has a paragraph on the Russia-Ukraine war, but as another paragraph on North Korea, without naming Russia, talks about the proliferation of weapons and arms to North Korea, and specifically mentions that a expert panel of the UN, which used to maintain, the sanctions reports of North Korea, was not renewed earlier this year, and that the Quad countries support its renewal, right? And it was not renewed because Russia vetoed its renewal in March. And then you have the Russia-Ukraine war and the segment of a just and lasting peace. uh, but even that formulation is slightly different from last year, because in 2023, the Hiroshima Declaration has rendering humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, whereas the Wilmington Declaration does not mention that line. So I want to bring the conversation here to Russia, given India's long-standing partnership with Russia. And while Russia has or may not be part of the larger conversation of the Indo-Pacific vis-a-vis China, or to the same extent as China, clearly there are certain paragraphs here which one could say take aim at Russia at some level or the other. So I just want to understand how is that being balanced, especially given India's long-standing ties, and Prime Minister Modi very likely going to meet President Putin again in next month in Kazan in Russia for the second bilateral meeting this year. So I just want to understand the sense over that.
See, I think there is no denying the fact that India is trying to balance some very critical equities, and it is very difficult to balance them given the state of the world that we live in. But I do think that what perhaps Prime Minister would have conveyed both in his bilateral with Biden and in the Quad, as part of the larger Quad framework, is that India's ability to still manage both its ties with Ukraine and Russia gives it certain vantage point which other countries don't have. You do not have the other three countries in the Quad that have direct access to President Putin, which India has. So in that sense, India's role in both as part of the Quad, and both as a partner of the US, becomes important for Washington as well as for Quad members. And I think uh, when you look at those principles that are enunciated, right, those principles are principles that India had been saying from the very beginning. It's not that India's position has changed in terms of international law, territorial integrity and sovereignty, UN charter, those kinds of. India has always framed its response to Russia Ukraine conflict through those principles. So long as those principles remain the fulcrum around which Quad's response to Russia would evolve, I think India would have no problem. I think India's problem will start when, and I think that's why you also see no direct reference to Russia as an aggressor, or that language is not used, because that is again something that India would not agree to. So because India's response is what it is, I think you see the language, what the way it is evolving. Now there are so many, in some ways, undercurrents in this situation for India, which I think for many in India are also not that easy to ignore, because what is also happening is that, look, we may say that Russia is that what is happening in Ukraine is something that is not happening in the Indo-Pacific, but the reality is that Russia is also an Indo-Pacific power. That eventually, but Russia has not accepted the logic of the Indo-Pacific so far. Russia is supporting, in some ways, Chinese, framework of the Indo-Pacific, or Chinese opposition to the idea of the Indo-Pacific. And it continues to toe that line in terms of Indo-Pacific and Quad. Although it does not mention that when it comes to India, it tries to keep itself away from that. But clearly, Russia's position on China and Russia's engagement with China, uh, if you look at it, what has happened in the last 2 to 3 years, that is something that is a cause for worry for India. So if that is a cause of worry for India, then that is, in some ways, that will also be reflected in India's engagement with the Quad, and India's position that the sooner this conflict is resolved, the better it would be from India's point of view. But I think, given the situation on the ground, I don't think that is in India's hand, or even that is also not in Quad's hands, for example. But where eventually, the needle will stop now depends on the November elections in the US. And if you have someone like Mr. Trump coming to office, then the situation may change very rapidly, as far as Russia is concerned as well. The Ukraine war is concerned. So I think, from that perspective, keeping it open ended, in the way that I look at the Quad declaration, it is about enunciating basic principles. It is about saying that, look, there is a challenge that is growing, and we need to figure out a response to it. Those kinds of formulations, may sound bland, but at the end of the day, they are also about looking at the lowest common denominator response of the four countries. And I think, in India's case, that more or less conforms to India's position in the Russia-Ukraine question from the very beginning. So I don't think that Quad as a platform, India has really used to target, Russia. There are subtle differences here which also come out, and I think that evolution that you see in Quad's position is also a reflection, perhaps, of the battlefield realities on the ground, where at this point both sides seem more intent on fighting than, coming to the negotiating table to find a sustainable outcome. Now, India has done its bit. Prime Minister Modi has traveled to both the countries, have had face-to-face encounters, and perhaps that is the position of both sides, the basic, negotiating strategies of both sides. He would have presented both at the bilateral level and the Quad level. So I think, in that sense, India's position remains unique, and in that sense, again, Keshav, just to end this, Quad also remains a unique platform, that you have a very difficult task for Quad. You are reconciling, um, you know, uh, three alliance partners with one non-alliance partner. So you have India. I think, in some ways, India is also very unique, and India's uniqueness perhaps makes Quad unique, because you really do not have any other platform that brings together so many issues on the table, where you have such distinct approaches to their security postures. India doesn't believe in alliances, or at least that's what our policymakers tell us. We don't want to have any alliances. The others are three members are alliance partners of each other. So that reflection, these ideas also become contested within the Quad space, and I think that's what perhaps makes Quad interesting, but also that also, in some ways, challenges, our idea of what perhaps Quad's future may or may not look like.
Right, so that was my last question. Thank you so much, Dr. Pant, for joining the print to discuss what you say is a very unique mini-lateral, but has so many questions surrounding, every Quad leader summit. Thank you for joining us here at the print, and to our audience, do subscribe below for more such news and analysis. Thank you.